All right, it's time to talk about the very last point, the service worker, to make our progressive web app. What is a service worker? Sounds like something useful, doesn't it? Service worker is a script that your browser runs in the background, separate from the web page web app. It is generally used for features that don't need a web page or user interaction. Remember the main thread that I kept talking about? How there's one worker that's trying to work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Well, think of service worker as another worker that you now have in the browser, a background worker. And it acts as what we call a programmable proxy, allowing us to control what happens on a request-by-request basis. And it's the reason that we can make our apps, our progressive web apps, work offline. That sounds pretty interesting, right? Now, service workers have been recently added into browsers, including Safari. And besides offline experiences, it also helps with background syncs and push notifications. But we're only going to talk about how Service Worker allows for offline experiences because that's its main feature. And things such as background sync and push notifications are still fairly new and best practices are still forming around them. I'll leave resources for you to explore this further if you're interested in those topics. But for now, let's get back to the most important part. How do we use a service worker? Well, if we go back to our Create React app, you might remember that we created within our Create React app, well, we didn't really create it. It created it for us, this file called register service worker. And if we go to index.js, we remember that in our main app that we render, we had our React DOM.render, but also we had this function, register service worker, that I kind of brushed it off up until now. This register service worker gets imported from, you guessed it, our register service worker file. And as you go through this file, it can look pretty overwhelming, but they have great comments to show you what it does. But let me show you the gist of it and what this entire file is doing. It's a lot simpler than you think. Let's open up a new tab here and open up our console. This is what the register service worker is doing. That's a little too big. Let's see if that works. It checks for browser support of service worker. So it's saying, hey, do we actually have service worker in our navigator or our browser? And remember, each browser has its own developer teams, and each browser can decide to implement this new feature called Service Worker or not. There's actually a really good website called Is Service Worker Ready that I'll link to, where you can see which versions of the browsers have implemented service workers. If we go back, we do this check because we want to make sure that when we do navigator.serviceworker, we don't get an error saying, we don't know about service worker. What are you talking about? So we say, if there's a service worker, we want to use this service worker property of the navigator, that is the browser, and we want to do something called register. And we want to register it using this file, this serviceworker.js file. And registering is just the common way for you to create a service worker on your web page. Now, where is this service worker.js coming from? If we go back to our app, this service worker.js is getting created from this file in our build folder. When we run npm run build in Create React app, we see that we now have a service worker.js file. And it's minified, so it's really, really hard to read. But all it's doing is running the default registration of the service worker that you can pretty much grab anywhere online. And that's it. It's literally just one single line. You see that it's a promise that returns the registration, and we can just log out some properties on it, but there's a successful registration. And if it fails, well, it fails, and we can say, oops, service worker registration fails. With just this if statement, we check if the browser has service worker. And if it does, we just simply run the register function. Fairly simple. Now, registering the service worker is going to cause the browser to start the service worker install step in the background, again, with the other worker. And once a service worker is activated and registered, this success case, it's going to be in one of two states. It's either going to be terminated to save memory, or it's going to be running in the background to fetch messages and events that occurs in the network request. Now, what does that mean? Before I get to that, let's go back to our application. Let me make this smaller. Go to the application tab, and you'll see here that we have below manifest the service worker tab. And we see that service worker right now, there's nothing here. But if I go to our demo app that is a progressive web app, and I click on service workers, we see that, oh, there's something here. It looks like there's a service worker that has been registered from serviceworker.js. It shows us when it was registered and the status. And right now it's stopped because, well, we're not doing anything with this page. We can unregister the service worker if we want. But it looks like on this web page, we have this service worker running. Let me show you a diagram to illustrate to you what this all means and why we care. You see, without a service worker, our browser is going to send a request to the network, this little icon. You can think of it as the internet network. We send a request, we find the server, and the server responds back with some files. Let's say a JavaScript file. But now that we have a service worker registered, we tell the browser, hey, before you go ahead and do this, talk to the service worker first. Maybe he knows something. You see, in a progressive web app, the service worker acts as what we call a network proxy. It intercepts any requests made first to the network, like I said, step 1 over here, and checks to see if you really need to communicate with the network, because maybe he already has those files. When a user opens a new screen of a progressive web app, the request for that page first goes to the service worker, not the network. The service worker then tries to access something called the cache API. And this is something that the browsers give you. Again, most browsers have this because they included this feature with service worker. And this cache API is kind of like a box where the browser stores files, such as JavaScript files, CSS files, any static files. It could be images. It could be anything you want. The worker tries to access, check the box and see, is whatever I'm requesting inside of this box? If the content is available, then we'll get the new page through here and the service worker is going to return the page. Regardless of the network activity, we're never requesting to the network. But if the service worker comes back and says, Mr. Browser, I don't have the file that you requested. You're going to have to talk to the network. Then we go back to talking to the network the old way that we did things and getting those files. Now, what is this cache storage API? Again, if we go back to our example and scroll down to cache, we have something called cache storage. And this cache storage is exactly what the service worker checks. If I click over here, we see that, oh yeah, we have a cache of a few JavaScript files and also some HTML. If I go to The other one, I see some icons that are also, and some lists that are also being cached. Very cool. So we cache the website or the shell of the website. Remember, whatever we want to work offline in this cache storage API via the service worker. So that on repeat visits, even though the very first time the user browses and goes to a website, it'll have to go to the network because this cache API will be empty. Once the network returns with those files, we can cache those files, and on repeat visits, the app shell can be loaded instantly. All right, stop talking, Andre. Show me how we can actually do this thing. Show me some code. Well, you're in luck. In the next few videos, we're going to go through these steps and finally turn our app into a progressive web app. Before I do that, again, I just want to show you how things work underneath the hood. If we go back to our Create React app, I wanted to show you how this would work before Create React app implemented service workers. Because right now it's kind of being done behind the scenes for you, which is really, really nice. But what if you had to implement it on your own? It's actually quite easy, and you can look at this page that I'm going to link to show you what you would have done. If you go over here, we see that all we needed to do was download something called Service Worker Precache. And in our build step, where we say React scripts build, we would just run this command, the Service Worker Precache with config of this file. Kind of similar to how Webpack config worked. So we give it this configuration file. In our index.html, we do the classic if service worker exists in the browser, we're going to register the service worker. We have our manifest file that we add. And then finally, with this package that we installed, SW Precache, well, here all we're doing is setting up the config, telling it that we want to use the build folder, and I want you to put in the cache any file that's an HTML file, and any JSON files or manifest.json file, and anything in the static folder. And we're going to use the serviceworker.js file path. That's it. And if you remember, in the static folder for Create React app, we have our CSS, JavaScript, and some media files. How simple is that? Very, very cool. Again, remember, we're just using the tools that browsers provide for us to make our websites faster. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.